Hello, church. Welcome to this week's message. My name is Henry Loke. This is God's Feeding Station. Thanks for being here. We continue on in our message series in the book of Isaiah, but I'm glad you're here. Thanks for taking time out of your week to spend it with me. Much appreciated. We continue in the book of Isaiah. We begin chapter 10 today, verses 1 through 4. It's woe to the oppressors. When pride takes over, when pride becomes the ruling attitude, it usually ends up in this place of oppression. And it goes through stages, though. It doesn't just go from 0 to 60 all at the same time. And a gentleman named St. Bernard has this thing of 12 degrees of humility and pride. We're just going to talk about the pride side today because that is what has gotten Judah and Israel. And today is what gets the nations of the world and the peoples of the world in trouble. We think we can do it without God. So the 12 stages of pride, according to St. Bernard, are this. Number 1, curiosity. When a man allows his sight and other senses to stray after things that don't concern him. 2, an unbalanced state of mind, showing itself in talk, unseasonably joyous and sad. 3, silly merriment, exhibited in too frequent laughter. Number 4, conceit, expressed in much talking. 5, eccentricity, attaching exaggerated importance to one's own conduct. 6, self-assertion, holding oneself more pious than others. 7, presumption, readiness to undertake anything. 8, defense of wrongdoing. 9, unreal confession detected when severe penance is imposed. 10, rebellion against the rules and the brethren. 11, liberty to sin. 12, habitual transgression. That last one, that really becomes a problem because you think you can do anything because you have the right to, because you deserve to, because you have the power to, because you have the money to, and because nobody seems to be able to stop you. And that last step takes a form that we see around the world all the time as oppression. It's one thing when competition pits brother against brother, one against another. It's another when you start to deprive one another of their rights in order to oppress them. That's the lowest point. That's the lowest point of pride. Warfare and conquest can be passed off as morality, can be passed off as good versus evil, can be passed off as courage or destiny. Oppression of those who have no power to fight, though, there's nothing that you can attach to that can make it palatable to the masses. People see it for what it is, and you can try to code it in something, in the code of morality, in the code of doing what's right, in the code of trying to preserve freedoms. But when oppression is attached to it, people see through that. And it's made worse when it occurs under the law that is understood to be laid out by God. You're going against God. You're going against His rules. You're going against His natural order of things. You're going against His will and His desire. So the oppression then becomes even worse. And Isaiah's point here is that the fate of the nation, be it Israel, Judah, or any other nation, will be determined according to God's standards. And so we begin in verses 1 and 2 today. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice, and to rob the poor of my people of their right, that widows may be their spoil, and that they may make the fatherless their prey. We hear a lot of talk these days of child trafficking, human trafficking, those types of things. That would fall under this definition of oppression, and it shows that the ways of man have not changed much over the centuries. Those responsible for maintaining law and order were doing so in such a way to enrich themselves at the expense of the helpless. Now, does that sound familiar? I will pick on politicians because they're an easy target. but it is so obvious of what happens, at least in this country, and probably countries around the world. But for instance, and I won't name names, but the average salary right now of congressmen and senators in this country is $174,000 a year. If you go back to 1987, when a particular congressman, came into office, who shall remain nameless, the salary then was $77,400. Between her or him and his or her spouse, now their net worth is $220 million. I'd love to know who their financial advisor is. And we hear reports all the time of insider trading and things going on that are illegal for the rest of us. This is a type of thing that this is talking about. It's also talking about things of business. It's also talking about when you cheat people and mistreat people who work for you in order to make a profit. You cheat them of their wages. You keep their wages low. Those types of things. There is a really interesting movie called The Molly Maguires with Sean Connery, and it's about coal mining in Western Pennsylvania, I believe, back in the day when Irish immigrants were coming over and working the mines there. And there's a great scene in that movie when at the end of the week, the miners come to collect their pay. And the salary for the week for this particular miner for delivering 14 cars of coal at 66 cents a car was $9.24. But then the mining company went on to deduct for 2 kegs of powder that they needed for blasting to get the coal loose, right? Deducted $5. For the oil that they used for their lamps, 2 gallons, deducted $1.50. 2 broken drills that they used to get the coal out, 30 cents. And charged them for using the pickaxe, the shovel, the cap, and the oil lamp. $1.90. So the total deductions were $9. So the miner was left with 24 cents at the end of the week. Isn't that ridiculous? But that was the state of things back in those days. And if you go back, and I've read a couple of books, a friend of the feeding station, actually, who I used to go to church with up at New Day, talked about, his brother wrote a book about the mining situation. And it's a really interesting book, and the name escapes me now. But it's a really interesting book. And things like this went on all the time. And this is what Isaiah is talking about. When you hold down people and you cheat people, particularly those, the widows, the orphans, the helpless, who cannot fight back, it is an affront to God. So in his word, God speaks of caring for the sheep, not fleecing the sheep. But it's amazing that the coal mine would charge the miners for the equipment that they would use to make the mining companies tens, hundreds, millions of dollars. But this is the nature of the business. And this is, again, goes to show that we have not changed as a people. We are of a fallen nature. We have not learned from history. We have not learned from our mistakes. And here we are. So Isaiah tells us, though, not to worry, because God's justice will be meted out. And again, I go to that argument I make all the time. If God is the same now as he was then, if he is never changing, then how do you think he feels about the things that are going on today? So we continue on in verses 3 and 4. What will you do on the day of punishment, in the ruin that will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help? And where will you leave your wealth? Nothing remains but to crouch among the prisoners or fall among the slain. For all this, his anger has not turned away, and his hand is outstretched still. God has entrusted those in leadership to care for his people. He is the one that puts them in their positions. You go to Romans 13. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. Well, if those who resist those put in leadership by God, what happens when those put in leadership by God abuse those under their charge? It goes both ways. Because when we get to Luke, if you turn to Luke 12, verses 42 through 47, it tells us what will happen when the master returns to see how the servant is doing with his stewardship. Luke 12, beginning at verse 42, Jesus says, "Who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom his master will set over his household, to give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant, whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed in coming,' and begins to beat the female and male servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. Now that servant who knew his master's will, but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating." Jesus taught the same as what Isaiah is saying here today. God is very purposeful in what he does, in whom he selects, and he's very precise in how those leaders and people in authority are to deal with the people under them, the people in their charge. And if they don't behave accordingly, they will answer for what they've done. Because Isaiah tells us it's not a matter of if the master will return, it's a matter of when the master returns. And when the master comes, all will give an account. For those who behave in this way that Isaiah is talking about, when happens, when the master returns, there will be no one to help and nowhere to hide. For the only place we know we can take refuge is in the one who judges rightly. And he will be the author of their disaster, those who have behaved in this way. And ill-gotten gains will be lost. Their power and their position that they have misused in order to enrich themselves on the backs of those who could not help themselves, those with less power and less means to stand up for themselves, it'll be meaningless before the judgment seat. Because in the end, death is the great equalizer. And when Jesus returns, all will be, stand and called to stand before the judgment seat. And all will be equal. Power, money, position, the size of your house, the car that you drove, the number of children you had, none of that will matter. All that will be taken into account is what you said, what you've done, how you've treated people, what was in your heart. And those that have enriched themselves at the expense of others then will find themselves, Isaiah says, cowering with the goats, lying in the heaps of those meant for eternal separation from God. And again, before the wrath of God, power, money, position, status means nothing. Absolutely nothing. And as I said last week, the outstretched hand of God is not stretched out in mercy, but in judgment against pride, false leadership, false prophets, devouring one's brother, oppressing the helpless. And we've talked a lot about Assyria and what's coming. Assyria is not the problem here. Assyria is not the worry. Assyria does not hold the future of Israel or Judah in its hand. Their future will be determined by God, by their failure to submit and obey God and live according to his principles. That failure, that pride will lead to destruction. And so we will either live to his glory or die smashing ourselves against the rocks of disobedience. And those like the Assyrians of the world do not hold the balances of the world in their hands. God does. And the Assyrians of the world will be judged right along with the rest of us.